All right, so welcome everybody to a new edition of our weekly podcasting here at España Confidencial, Navarra Confidencial. I'm your host, Hugo Estornayolo Silva. I'm the Latin America correspondent for España Confidencial, and today I'm joined by, well, two of the youngest, but I think most relevant, most important members of the rebirth of the paleo movement in the United States. From the paleo libertarian side, we have Phil Bishop from the Mises Institute, and from the paleo conservative side, we have Pedro González from the Charlemagne Institute. So, welcome, gentlemen. It's such a pleasure to have you, the two of you, here right now because, well, I'm really excited about this, the paleo movement and the way it is coming together again. It's such an example for the rest of us who are not in the United States. Welcome, welcome.
Well, thank you so much.
So good to be here.
Yeah, thank you for hosting us.
You found the two. You found the one libertarian that I would agree to do this with. No, I'm kidding. No, I like them. I always say, I'm going to put headphones on too. I always say that of all the libertarians, the Mises people are the ones that I like the most because I think you guys are more grounded in reality than a lot of other libertarians. So I don't know if this is a good start. Immediately start bashing the other side, but.
Oh no, it's okay. I bash libertarians as much as any conservative out there, so I think that's some of our common ground right there.
Yeah, there you go. Off to a good start.
Well, I usually begin every of these podcasts with each of our guests to introduce themselves to our audience. So if you would like to introduce yourself, Phil, you're ready to go.
Yeah. Well, again, I do work for the Mises Institute, which has been one of the great honors of my life. Prior to that, I worked with the House Financial Services Committee. I came on board after the kind of the Tea Party revolution, so I got to see the rise of that sort of populist, conservative sort of movement, and also why it failed. The number of people in D.C. that became corrupted by the institutions of power up there. And for the last 6 years now, I've been able to help with the institute. And one of the things I think makes us unique is that we're developing a new generation of scholars interested in the ideas crucial to civilization. And I think that Austro-libertarianism as kind of its own branch is unique because it takes into account the strong economic foundations that understand the role of markets, but also doesn't suffer from some of the fallacies of a lot of libertarians out there that are either utopian in nature or egalitarian in nature, are hostile to religion and cultural conservatism. And so it's an honor to be able to try to be a part of that tradition, and that's why I try to keep going forward.
Thank you, Phil. All right, now it's your turn, Pedro.
So I'm just a writer, really. I got into the industry about 4 years ago when I started to seriously write and comment on politics and society and culture and things like that. And I have flirted with different strains of the right, with different strains of conservatism, but I always was attracted to paleo-conservatism. And as much as I try to not label myself as a conservative and avoid using these labels at all, I think it's fair to say that I'm basically a paleo in my sentiments, that I'm more inclined to favor things like particularism and culture, and I don't think of America in abstract terms like Tho and like a lot of paleo-libertarians. I'm also deeply skeptical of things like egalitarianism and universalisms and these things that basically separate a nation from its actual flesh and blood people and where it exists in space and time, which I think is characteristic of neoconservatives and other branches of conservatism. And I think it's interesting because paleoconservatism has always been kind of on the fringe in the sense that its ideas weren't necessarily radical. In fact, I think they've been closer to the heart of the American people for the longest time, but they're fringe in an intellectual sense, in the sense that they're not compatible with, say, what the Heritage Foundation wants, and so they don't really get to sit at the table like National Review does. But I think that one aspect of the Trump moment in 2016 was that you basically saw the coming home of the Pat Buchanan movement and of this movement that was defined by both paleo conservatives and paleo libertarians. and it culminated in the election of Trump. And so I'm happy to represent that camp.
Yes.
I work for Chronicles magazine, which is like the flagship of the Buchanan movement. It's been right on pretty much all the issues since for like the last 40 years, and it's been ecumenical in the sense that it's been a home for paleo conservatives, paleo libertarians, and others who kind of who have until recently, I should say, existed on the margins of right-wing discourse.
Well, actually, two of my main daily reads are the Mises Wire of the Mises Institute and some of the articles published by Chronicles. So I think I'm very much in the middle of these two positions. I like libertarianism because I think markets are good and that people have to be free, but I don't think that this current situation in which we're in all of the Western civilization is good for people to be free as they think free means, because they are not free to do good. They are not free to prosper. They are not free to whatever, to have faith. They are free to be degenerate. So I think that the main problem right now, even if we're talking about politics, is on a cultural level. So my first question for you two is, where do you think that the paleo movement stands today, considering the culture wars, CRT, wokeism, and every other phenomena that is happening right now in the United States and elsewhere? You will begin, though.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the reality is the American conservative movement, which again I think the paleos stand, against, outside of it in the true power sense, has been a failure in part because of their refusal to seriously engage with people like Paul Gottfried and Murray Rothbard and Pat Buchanan. And I think that's one of the things that gave birth to this Trump movement, was that you had a lot of Americans who always considered themselves conservative, that recognized that they were being, having their leaders fail them. And people were angry, and that anger continues. And, I think that this moment right now in American history is one of the most fascinating in a very long time, because it's precisely when the people, right? The state, it doesn't matter what the form of government is, if the people do not feel that the state is legitimate, if they do not feel that it recognizes and represents their interests, then that's where you see real interesting political change happen. And I think that's, one of the concerns I had of the Trump movement would be, would they see that as a victory and then go home? But when you have the fact that 70% of Trump supporters view Joe Biden as an illegitimate president, when you have distrust in the Supreme Court at higher levels because of their refusal to take these issues seriously, when you have distrust in the FBI, Congress has always been low approval ratings. Even the military now, conservatives recognizing the dangers posed by a left infiltrating that. But unfortunately, the National Republican Party continues to fail. This is one of the things that I think Pedro's been great at, is highlighting how the biggest threat to conservatives in America right now is not the left, but a Republican Party, an American right, that refuse to actually stand against them. And so when you continue to see conservatives promote the growth of the secular state religion, as was the case with this Juneteenth holiday imposed upon a country that didn't care about it. They are trying to replace those Christian roots, and they've been doing this for a long time. Right? This isn't a modern phenomenon, but they're trying to replace the unique Christian Western roots of America with a secular agenda that goes against the culture that made America great in the first place. And so I think that libertarians that refuse to appreciate that Western heritage and the morality of Christian values, while just simply focusing purely on markets and us being individual pleasure units and this, that is where we lose the real America. At the same time, though, if we don't recognize that we need to focus on the questions of what creates prosperity in the first place, I think that's where Murray Rothbard tried to do so much work in highlighting how the biggest critiques that exist now of our current economy are not the result of free markets, but instead of the insidious nature of central banking. And that's, I think, if there's one critique I have really of the broader American populist movement, it is a blind spot there on the unique role of central banking and the way that has distorted culture in the West.
Thank you. So, all right, back to you, Pedro.
The last point is really good. I mean, this is a lot. That's a lot to think about. Like how the prosperity that we've come to know is actually borrowed, right? Borrowed through central banking, but also borrowed through outsourcing labor to, whether it's through its immigrants or literally outsourcing to other countries. All of this is like borrowed prosperity, in the sense that it's not prosperity that we really created, as much as it's kind of like debt, and that stuff eventually comes home. But anyways, I think, why did conservatism fail? Well, first of all, it has failed. I think that's probably the correct place to start with, because I think we're in denial a lot of times about the state of the conservative movement. In my opinion, it has failed on its own terms, in one way. And so when we talk about the culture war, I always like to begin from the point that you've lost. And that's not to be a downer, but it's to ask people to consider, why do you think it is we've lost? Or why does it seem like no matter how many of these like small skirmishes that you may win, it seems like you're still losing this broader battle, right? And I think a huge part of it is the fact that conservatism by nature, because it's conservative in the sense that it wants to preserve the established political order, it seems to kind of unwittingly digest the atmosphere that is created by the opposition. So what I mean by that is the symbols, the language, the tropes, the narratives of the left that the left creates. The left says, this is our morality. These are American values. The conservatives it seems like they always go through a kind of like staged process of denying it, kind of like being outraged by it, but then coming to terms with it and accepting a moderate, basically, position of what the left has already established is the only acceptable position. So ultimately, over time, you just get a conservative movement that is always kind of living in the shadow of the opposition, and so it's not really opposition. And the Juneteenth thing is a perfect example of this. Democrats did not mince words about what the day means for them. For them, it's a reminder of how horrible this country is, and how horrible white people are, how much work there is still to do, and all that. Republicans basically, they implicitly agree with this, but they say, well, let's focus on how far we've come. I mean, you're right about how horrible things used to be, and you're right about how we need more egalitarianism and all this stuff. But let's try to put the emphasis on the good. Basically, it's you're getting the same thing, just kind of at like a slower drip. And I think this is this is why I don't like to identify as a conservative, because I think what's built into the cake of conservatism is that you're conserving the existing political order, which is not what I want to do. And I think that's not what a lot of Americans want to do. I mean, this is what fueled not just the candidacy of Donald Trump, but also Bernie Sanders. People are deeply unhappy with the American political system and feel that it is illegitimate. It's not just Trump supporters that feel this. And so, yeah, I think this is one reason why I think conservatism has failed, because it seems to, above all, serve its enemies, even if it doesn't intend to. And second, because what are we trying to conserve? Central banking? Tax cuts for Jeff Bezos? Like, I don't know. I don't know what the conservative movement is trying to conserve at this point.
Yeah, but the problem is that since the United States is pretty much the current incarnation of the ideal of empire in the West, you have a lot of other sovereign states that actually look up to the United States, and they are being perverted in their own ideas. My own country, Ecuador, we have US dollars as our legal currency, and a lot of our trade relations and so on are with the United States. So when you import, as well as you import currency and some goods and services, we are importing a culture as well. And that culture is perverting the values that we try to preserve in here. It is supposed, my country, to be very, very conservative, because we used to be a Catholic country. But right now, you are seeing some kind of a sweetened version of the culture wars that are happening in the United States. We're fighting here against abortion, we're fighting here against gay marriage, we're fighting here against a lot of the progressive movement but we're fighting in a much sweetened, lightweight than it happens in the United States. We don't have a racial problems yet, but we will do in the coming future. So the problem that having a country such as yours, as the United States, and not being able to preserve what that country means, especially when your country is pretty much an empire and it inspires other people all around the world, is that the rest of the people will follow suit. Well, considering this, I would like to ask you about certain economic things and ideals, because I think that's the point where you two not get together the most. Because, Phil already talked about the central banking, and I've seen that some of your articles, Pedro, are very they praise some populist leaders and techniques that were pretty much socialist, like Hugo Long. So I would like for you to talk about how do you think is the role of the United States on the economic level right now, and especially for what would be the role of the federal government for the paleo movement. I would like for Pedro to begin right now, actually.
Okay. Yeah, so my view is that basically, even if you wanted to accomplish libertarian ends, if you wanted to shave off parts of the regime, you'd have to do it in a kind of, you'd have to basically become a statist. I think this is a kind of paradox for fixing our problems, that if you wanted to shrink the size of the government, well, first you'd have to assume control of the government, and second, you'd have to exercise power as a kind of statist. I think this makes a lot of people, not just libertarians, uncomfortable, but basically I think you would need a kind of reverse FDR character, someone who is domineering and someone who is willing to basically impose themselves and their agenda on the regime from the top down. And so for my part, I think that even if you wanted to get something like a return to a vague small r republicanism, you'd have to do it through this populist vehicle and through a willingness to use the power of government, in other words, to use the power of the state to reform the state, to break off parts of it and dissolve other parts of it. I think this is a problem that the right faces, a right that in the United States associates with limited government. But as far as policies that people call me like a crypto socialist for, I do think that the state could have a role in promoting like family formation. I look at countries like Hungary that are using these different social policies to encourage people to have children, because Hungary does not want to do what every other country is doing, and that is relying on immigration to keep themselves demographically alive. Instead, they're doing something that everyone said is impossible, and they're improving the native the native fertility rate and decreasing abortion rates through policies that are being deliberately crafted for the good of the Hungarian people. It's not because they view this as like economically sound for them or something like that. I'm sure in the end maybe it will be, because more people, right? More people consuming and producing things. But the point is that for Hungary, the economic system is intended to serve its people, which I think, again, if that gets me called a socialist or a statist or whatever, I don't really care. But I think that is the thing that people will associate with me and call me those things for, is because I do think that the state can and should have a role in doing these things. So I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you, Pedro. Back to you, though.
Yeah. Well, to start off on your point earlier, you're absolutely true. I mean, the shadow of the American empire. One of the great tragedies, at my heart, I believe in American exceptionalism. I believe in the incredible nature of America's founding. And it is despicable to see America become the evil empire, having such a negative effect with our economic system, with our military state. You know, the fact that if you are a country like Armenia, and if you were to accept American aid fighting your enemies, think of how much is going, what we were trying to impose upon that country in terms of its views on gay marriage and things like that. We've become the most repulsive form of empire we've ever seen, because usually in the past, at least, empires have inspired pride amongst its people. We have an empire that wants us to be ashamed of our history and our heritage. This is despicable. And so actually, I think that in terms of, my understanding of politics has changed a great deal because of the moment we've lived in the last 5+ years. My interest in populist politics, and this is why I very much enjoyed, for example, Pedro's article on Huey Long, because I think it's very interesting when you look back and you understand what allowed individual political figures to have the power to stand up against the regime that had long run things. And it's because what it requires is the people to feel that that champion actually represents them. And the problem is that a lot of the people that are very good on economics, that can defend free markets, they have this really weird disconnect from the way that average people operate. And Murray Rothbard understood this. Murray Rothbard criticized, for example, the work of F.A. Hayek, with his idea that, if we can simply, interact with the elites of academia, then we can have a trickle-down sort of policy approach. The problem is that the elites are in on the game. The biggest benefactors of this corrupt system are the academics that get to be put in positions of power. There's a lot of people on the right that are skeptical for democracy, and there's very good reasons for that, historical arguments. But if you look around the world right now, the one area where the right has really made major wins has been in democracy. The biggest problem that we have in Washington is less those elected. I mean, a lot of them are worthless, but those aren't the real evil actors. It's the Faucis. It's the Jay Powells. It's the unelected technocrats that benefit from this system. And so I think that when it comes to looking at ways on what are the proper roles of the state, for example, I think it's interesting. I mean, particularly given how this anti-humanist zeitgeist that's being pushed on, you see declining fertility rates and things like that. I think there's a lot of interesting things going on in countries like Hungary. I think my biggest criticism, though, of the American nationalist movement and sort of these sort of things is a fundamental miscalculation that the American nation is not the United States of America. The American founding fathers saw themselves as citizens of their states. And so I think that if you're looking at a country like America with 33 million people, or 330 million people, right, there's no way that you can create a powerful state that can take into account all of the unique aspects of the various nations of this unit, right? And so that's why I think rather than trying to impose some sort of libertarian universalism on the, because most people aren't libertarians, right? The demand out there for a libertarian state, you have some out there that want that. And we should allow for the creation of libertarian societies where those that believe that want to have a purely voluntarist society, I want them to have the freedom to do that. But we should recognize, however, that not everyone wants that. And if we simply identify the biggest issue, I think, with the American government now, it is the flipping. We have so much of our authority vested in an isolated capital, so disconnected from the average day men and women. If you want to have conversations about how can we have, for example, a healthcare state that looks more like the Sweden or Denmark, right? Then we can have that conversation in Vermont, in Florida.
Yeah.
We shouldn't have that on a national level. And so the political decentralization, I think, is the key to liberty, far more than trying to push this universal libertarian message that doesn't seem to want to take into account culture wars. Because ultimately, limited government requires self-governance. And there's certain aspects that get people to be self-governing. And that's not simply removing legal barriers, right? We need more than that.
Well, you're putting on the table something that I've been seeing. It's taking off in conservative circles, which is about the localism. Every people should be able to govern themselves in their own communities, in their own neighborhoods, their own states, provinces, and so on and so forth. So, well, for you, the questioning here would be, how could a populist right promote more localism, more decentralization on their politics? I think I've seen the example of Governor DeSantis in Florida, but I don't know if that can be replicated elsewhere. So I would like for Tho to begin, and then back to you, Pedro.
No, absolutely. And I think Ron DeSantis, the fact that Ron DeSantis is being so elevated to me as someone who is a libertarian, who values liberty, And his popularity comes precisely because he respected the freedoms of average Floridians, right? He opened up aggressively before anyone else. And what's important about that is not simply that he did it on, he recognized that the public policy experts selling bad science, selling propaganda, selling what Hayek called scientism, that was a much greater threat than the virus itself. And it was the fact that you're seeing this area where state governors, we also saw this with Democratic governors under Trump, right? They were a lot more aggressive in interjecting their state sovereignty than Republicans had been under Obama. And so hopefully, I think, what I would like to see is for the American conservative movement to recognize that the hope of trying to turn Washington, D.C. into some sort of weapon for conservative values is going to be doomed to fail because they have all the advantages on their turf. What we need is instead a strategy of something more along the lines of national liberation movements, where Florida separates itself from that elite, where there's so many people that don't believe that Congress can be fixed, right? We need, and so that's what I support. And then I think that if you then compare the performances, like Florida is performing so well relative to a lot of other states because we've also taken care of the economic side of things. So we have the lowest spending per person in the country as a state. We've done a lot of work on the regulatory side. We've done a lot on the licensing side. And so when you're able to break out from the box that federal politics is in, and you can instead deal with the real problem solving of governance at the state level, that is where we can actually take that battle into arenas where we can win. Because conservatives have won at the state level far more than they have in DC for 100 plus years.
Right, back to you, Pedro.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. And I think that one thing that people had floated under Trump's tenure that obviously nothing ever came of it was to literally decentralize DC in the sense of moving like HUD to like Detroit and moving like the Department of Agriculture to like Nebraska, and to physically decentralize it, but I think just as importantly is to culturally delegitimize DC as basically if you want to do anything important, you have to move to DC, right? Well, that just kind of validates this culture, it validates the underpinnings of the administrative state, all the things that I think we can all agree are bad about the United States government. And so I don't know how we could get this done. Maybe if we ever get another Trump-type president again, but I think that would actually be a huge thing because the focus on DC does distract from what is happening on the local and state level, where I bash on the GOP every single day because they deserve it, but I'm primarily talking about the institutional Republican Party, the Republican Party whose heart is in DC. But I'm also careful to acknowledge that on the local and state level, there are good people doing good things. The problem is that they usually end up bumping up against the superstructure of their own party. I think a great example of this is the Republicans who no one knows their names in South Dakota, who managed to smoke out this transgender sports bill and basically fought tooth and nail to get it to Governor Kristi Noem's desk just so that she could veto it. So I think the question is how do you channel these populist energies that already do exist and basically replicate the success of Florida in places like South Dakota? And I think that's a good question, but I think it's also a long game. This is not something that we're going to solve in 2024 or 2028. This is something that we're in for the long haul. But I do think that Florida offers an example of what can be accomplished. I think what DeSantis has done is remarkable. When other Republicans were kowtowing to rioters last year, DeSantis proposed a bill that would allow store owners to shoot looters and protect themselves. And on top of the coronavirus stuff, I mean, basically the things that DeSantis has done are things that conservatives said could not be done. Like you can't sign an anti-rioting bill during rioting. Insane. DeSantis did it, and it was tremendously popular. So I think that Florida is an example of what can be accomplished in different states across the country. Again, we're talking about a long game here, not something, how do we win back the country in 2024 with the next presidential election? Oh, that's not going to happen.
Well, In here, I think that a question of third parties could also be put on the table, since I've seen some of the Christian right mostly try to adhere to the Solidarity Party. For example, I've seen the example of Rod Dreher and so many others, and I've seen that there's some kind of tendency in the Libertarian Party to make it a more right-wing party, especially with what happened in New Hampshire. So my question here would be, what about doing a third party in the United States to channel those populist energies instead of relying on the GOP? I would like for Pedro to begin, and then for Tho.
I have no idea how we get a third party in the United States. It seems this is a question that always comes up, and it's just difficult to answer because it seems so unviable. But at the same time, I think this would actually probably be our actual best hope, would be an alternative. And I think that realistically, you would only get a third party if the Republican Party became completely politically unviable, or if someone forced a split within the GOP. And I think those are probably the two most realistic ways, because that's happened before. We've had parties in the United States that split up and then become two separate parties. I think those are the two most realistic ways that's going to happen. How and when that happens, I'm not sure. I think it's a matter of time and circumstance. But the reason I think that this would be desirable is that an issue with the Republican Party is that its funding structure, I think, doesn't allow it to really change. So you get someone like Trump, who runs as a populist, who defends to Ted Cruz on a debate stage universal health care, which Trump was a lifelong proponent of this, and Ted Cruz thought he got him dead to rights by bringing it up on the debate stage. Trump defended it and then won Texas. So I mean, this was a pretty radical guy, I think, for Republicans, right? But then he actually takes office, and what does he do? He drops his infrastructure plan and goes along with the McConnell, Paul Ryan tax cuts and jobs plan, and then basically governs as a pretty conventional Republican. There are populist flourishes, but all in all, I mean, the staples of his presidency are the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and the First Step Act. Those are the two things that he talks about the most, and the two cornerstones of his policy. So, and I think part of the reason that happened is that Trump basically got captured by the GOP and didn't have the tools or the will or the personnel, whatever, to overcome that issue and increase the polarization between his populist base and the GOP. And instead, he kind of just allowed himself to be absorbed by the GOP. And so basically, the irony of the whole art of the deal thing is that every time he made a deal with the GOP, he was making a deal with the swamp. And I think that, again, it comes back to this problem of how do you fundamentally change the Republican Party so that you can fundamentally change the country if the Republican Party's lifeblood, its funding structure, its interest groups will not allow that to happen.
Well, I think Pedro's absolutely correct. I mean, America has a two-party system. And if you try to yada that away for idealistic purposes, this is something libertarians are really good at doing, then that just tells me you're not serious about your ideas. If you care, then you engage with the world as it is. You don't pontificate as if the world is as you want it to be. And so that's why I get frustrated with a lot of those conversations. And this is something unique to America, right? You know, we've seen overseas, we've seen in Spain, right? You had like the Vox Party, that's a fairly modern party. We've seen various interesting right-wing populist parties emerge in other styles of government. And that's good. I'm not saying that the answer to save Great Britain is through Boris Johnson and the Tories, right? Like that's not my position. But within America, we have a two-party system. And so you can either replace one of the two parties, which, as Pedro mentioned, has happened in American history, or you try to take it over. And the biggest problem with Trump is that when he took over, he was far too forgiving. Trump's biggest sin was that he was far too forgiving to his enemies. When he won, he should have purged the party. He should have gotten rid of these people. He should have taken Paul Ryan out to the woodshed when Paul Ryan abandoned him during the campaign. He didn't. And so a lot of the compromises that were made, I think, are valid. The problem is, the thing is, though, is that what we saw is that the Republican base is not beholden to the National Party, right? You had National Review, the big purple magazine, full of all the big names in conservatism, and people didn't care. They liked the guy that sounded like him, fighting their enemies, punching them in the face. And so what we need is someone that can rebuild, that can focus that trust of the base. And I think Ron DeSantis can do it. Trump is still Trump in the eyes of the base. And one of the interesting things about DeSantis's record is that he took over. I mean, he was a big enemy of the Florida Republican Party when he became governor in 2018, because he took out the party chosen candidate in Adam Putnam then. And so hopefully someone like Governor DeSantis can see where, how we didn't perhaps get as far as we could have in that moment, and perhaps has learned his lessons. The fact that DeSantis has been so effective at really going after the true institutions of power, right? The public policy apparatus, the corporate press, the universities, right? The cultural zeitgeist. You don't see him out there, pandering to the LGBTQ crowd that will always hate Republicans. You don't see him out there with a Juneteenth avatar next to his tweets, right? He's fighting these cultural battles, and so hopefully that's what gives me hope in the short term. Because while I think it's possible that we can make this larger gains, I do worry about the left, because we right now have the most dangerous combination of corporate and political power. With how incestuous the relationship is between the Harris-Biden administration and big tech and some of these Wall Street and some of these firms, we need to get someone to break that up now. And so whether it's we need a Trumpian-like figure, and so hopefully someone like DeSantis can do it. And I also think the funding mechanisms of the party, it's a great point. And one of the people that I think have been best at articulating this message is another Florida politician, Matt Gaetz, who has regularly gone after Republicans taking corporate money. And that's something we have to get serious at. If Disney can buy Florida legislators for for $100,000, right, and get a loophole carved in that immunes them from big tech, that is creating those bad incentives, that bad incentive structure, right? And so we need a GOP that recognizes that it will have strength as a party by turning down the big fundraising dollars and instead embrace a small grassroots fundraising base. And people like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene have been great at building a nationwide base with small donors that I think can help isolate them to some extent. It's not perfect. No one's perfect. I don't need people to be perfect. But that, I think, gets to some of those structural changes that Pedro is 100% right at. They go to the core of the weakness of the GOP.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to add something, Pedro, go on, please.
I thought about, there's this article in Politico published recently. I mean, it's a dumb article. Politico's horrible, and it gets everything wrong. But there's one line that cuts close to the truth, and the line is, the article's about how the GOP is now the working class party, which it's really funny because the author seems to take it seems to take it seriously that the GOP is somehow fundamentally changed after Trump, and so he frames the conflict as the GOP wants to be like the racist working class party, but basically corporations want nothing to do with that. And I think the second part is true. The first part is not really true. And he writes that businesses in America, big business, is not xenophobic, is not isolationist, and is not protectionist. He uses those terms, which I think is hilarious, because if you just strip them of the hysterical terminology, he's right. Corporations, the most powerful interest groups in this country, have no interest in immigration restrictionism. They have no interest in anti-interventionism, and they have no interest in anti-globalism. All three of these things, which are the planks of populism, not left or right or conservative or liberal populism, these things are the anathema of interest group, of corporations, of financial institutions, whether it is Amazon or BlackRock or Apple or JP Morgan Asset Management. And so the Republican Party is caught between a base that is increasingly populist and the interest groups that it wants to cater to on the one hand. And so basically it's trying to win back corporations from the Democratic Party while also telling its the base, after Trump, we're the real working class party now. We really care about families and issues that affect the workers, like immigration. But like you see what they're doing is like they're trying to walk two different roads at the same time, and I think it culminated actually during the Juneteenth thing, in the same week that the new changed multiracial working class Republican Party declared our new National Independence Day, Juneteenth. You had this story about how Kevin McCarthy is not happy with this raft of bills that would either break up or severely cripple tech companies like Amazon, Apple, Google. Kevin McCarthy said the bills would be too harsh, that they would give regulators too much power over companies like Google. And as it turns out, one of the lawyers who's representing, I think, Amazon and Google against the federal government is a close friend and a close personal friend of Kevin McCarthy. So this is a structural problem. I think that's the best way to refer to it, as Tho said. And it's a structural problem that will slap on like an LGBTQ sticker or like a Black Lives Matter sticker, and that is used to kind of deceive the Republican base that somehow the party has changed for the better, although it hasn't really.
Well, I think the woke capital. I mean, the problem is that they're trying to fool everyone. I mean, you have people that you have angsty teenagers that think they're fighting the establishment on the left, right? By sounding exactly like a corporate Twitter account, right?
Yeah.
but I think the key though is to understand how do we get to this place, because and this is where I think that again this goes back to the issue of central banking, because like this is the catalyst for this era of globalization, of financialization, that has done the most to screw over working Americans and benefited the elite. Right? Because for the last 10 years, for example, low interest rates. So if you are a normal saver, you've been screwed. You're getting nothing for having your money in a bank. But if you're a large investor that's in stock markets and other financial assets, you've been a huge winner the past 10 years because of a structure of easy credit and cheap money. And so what we have to understand is that the corporate giants, the reason why there's consolidation in this country of corporate power more than ever before, is because our economic system is built to do that. If you are a large firm, regardless of how well you're run, you can borrow cheaper, buy your competitors, consolidate your power. And whereas if they actually had to borrow, money at a market price, right? If we weren't subsidizing those acquisitions, would Facebook have the large market power they has now? And so the problem is that libertarians make the mistake. Well, they will see that we have these corporations saturated in state privilege and say, oh well, for the free market says we can't do anything. I think that's a mistake. We need to get serious about this, particularly when they are bad faith actors weaponizing their power for political purposes. If you after the 2020 election in the United States, the censorship of like the Hunter Biden story, if that is not an example of cardinalized behavior for explicitly political purposes, then I don't know, we're not watching the same thing, right? So we have to deal seriously with that. My concern, though, is that historically, for example, I consider myself more of a Jacksonian populist, because Jackson went after the heart of state privilege. He went after the central banks. He went after the big actors. My fear is something like Teddy Roosevelt populism, because what Teddy Roosevelt did is that he did go after, he busted trust. But he busted the trust that his backers wanted busted. And so that's my fear of using the federal regime with it, because I don't trust good outcomes from that. My fear is that you'll end up having something more along the lines of the fairness doctrine than having an open platform. And so that's where, again, I think a decentralized approach going, you get Florida experimenting with things, other states experimenting with things. I'm open to like the Florida legislation and trying to curb some of these excesses of big tech. But I think fundamentally, though, if we don't focus on the root of the cause, which is the role of central banking and financialization, then I think we're attacking symptoms, and my fear is there's consequences to that.
Yeah, that's right. It's like, I feel the same way about immigration. We can rail about the people crossing the border or like people overstaying their visas, but you're missing that's just a symptom of an immigration system that exists to serve a fused political and industrial interests. And until you cut at the heart of that, you're just going to be angry at people crossing the border illegally or something. So.
Yeah, and you see, the system pretty much seems to be rigged for the elites, and you don't have like the local elites that should be the ones running, because they're pretty much the people who know about their places, about their states, about their cities. You have people in DC, you have people in New York, you have people in I don't know, in Philadelphia. They are the guys doing everything to keep the country. Well, you have the guys in California doing everything to keep the country the way they want for them to prosper, and not for the rest of the people. So my question for you two would be, how could the paleo movement go against these elites, or if they could try to create or to find their own counter elite against them? I would like for Pedro to begin.
So can you repeat that?
Oh, my question is about how could the paleo movement go against the elites, or alternately, try to create their own elite to counter them.
To counter the elites?
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the important things that, for one, you have to identify the sources of power, right? And I think that's one of the things that's changed on the right, is that conservatives and libertarians both, they focus so much on power being the state, right? And I think that's one of the things the Trump era has done, and platforms like Tucker Carlson's show, and there's a recognition. I know I see this when dealing with average Republicans here in Bay County, Florida, which is a conservative area. They recognize that it's not simply Democrats in Congress that are their enemy, that it is Coca-Cola pushing anti-white propaganda in their HR departments, right? They recognize that it's Disney, trying to hurt careers of actresses that speak out against certain agendas, right? They're recognizing that the issue is not simply Democrats narrowly, and so that's a starting spot. You have to have, I think, your average person aware of how, acknowledges how dangerous the problem is. And that's why I think when you see the breakdown of institutional trust, that's a big goal there. I think also, though, that when you recognize how fundamentally corrupt these structures are, the key then is to create these parallel institutions, right? And so I think one of the biggest things that needs to happen, every Republican government in this country needs to recognize that the Fed has mishandled this economy for 12 years, the same way that Fauci and the technocrats in the public health sphere have mismanaged COVID. We have a Fed that is destroying all sanity. I mean, we're living in a decade of bad medicine. And so if you want to get serious about that, we need state level action to, Texas has done it with the gold bank. Wyoming has been a leader on cryptocurrency and things like that, because the growth of the state is interconnected with their control of the financial system through the central bank. And so if you have state actors recognize that's the problem, then we can start building, if you start having, let's say you had half of all Republican controlled states basically start accumulating gold, Bitcoin, these other financial assets, and set a signal that they have, that the Fed is not, it's a vote of non-confidence against the financial elite. I think that starts creating structural pressure there that matters. And of course, then outside of that, you need people to get serious about boycotting corporations, things like that. The problem is, so much of this stuff is so baked into our society, right? Like it's nothing that's going to happen easily. We've got a lot of stuff we have to work out. But I think that's one of the issues where if the conservative movement can recognize that catalyst, that cornerstone, then we can start making significant inroads in terms of power structures. The other thing is university system. Again, and that's why the fact that conservatives are starting to recognize that there's no way we need average conservatives stop sending little Johnny and Susie to college if they don't know what to do, because that's a status thing. It starts with us at an individual level recognizing the corruptness of these institutions, and then exiting out as much as we can. Again, it's not easy. It's not a silver bullet out there, but I think these are meaningful steps that can happen if we have the will to do it.
All right, back to you, Pedro.
Yeah, I think Theo hit the point about parallel institutions well. And I think that because we're talking about creating a new elite, but I think part of that entails delegitimizing the existing elite and discrediting them, and as much as possible, wounding them. And so, something that I've seen that I think is really interesting is that GOP treasuries in different states recently threatened to basically withdraw assets from, I think it was institutions that are that want to boycott fossil fuel. Uh, I, I don't want to get too much into detail because I'll butcher it. Because the story was in Axios, I think, 2 weeks ago, and I read it and thought, man, this is really interesting. I need to come back to this and write something about it. But basically, you have Republican treasuries on the state level engaging in what is basically something that the Republican voters have wanted them to do, like come up with some innovative way to land a blow against these corporations, against these financial institutions that are undermining our way of life. And when they ask for that, the Republican Party says, no, we're the limited government party, or like, well, no, that will wreck the GDP if we do something like that. But then when some donor says, look, you need to put pressure on XYZ company and threaten this, or else you're not going to get my money anymore, they'll do it. They'll do something as drastic as having the state treasury say, like, we're going to withdraw our assets from you. Like, I need to find the story and finally write something about it, but it's just remarkable, because that is the kind of thing that we want from the Republican Party, that kind of drastic action that is, like, I think deeply terrifying to the ruling class. They won't do it for you, but they'll do it for, like, the fossil fuel industry. And so we need to figure out a way to make them do it for us. Because again, in any other circumstance, in any other context, that would be considered like statism, a terrible abuse of government power. But the GOP is just like, no, we like fossil fuel, we like our donors in the gas and oil industry, and we're going to secure their interests. And it's just totally remarkable that they did that. And if I write an article about that, it's going to be called, when statism is okay, or something like that. But on the point of creating alternative elites, again, I think this is like a long project, but part of it is getting kids to stop going to like Harvard and these schools that don't teach them how to think, but teach them how to think. But then we also need to find a way to educate a new elite. And elite it's a fancy sounding word, but it really just means people that are going to be the ones pulling the levers of power wherever they go, whether it's in a state legislature or in a bureaucracy somewhere, whatever. People that are basically going to have a specialized skill set that enables them to be to operate on some kind of official capacity. That's all we're talking about here, whether it's a CEO or a bureaucrat, right? So how do we do that? How do we educate a new generation of elites? Does that mean creating new universities? Does that mean creating new think tanks? Which immediately I sound like a Republican hack when I say that, but really it's like, how do you educate a new generation of people to think like we do? And I think it sounds hackish, but I don't think it is necessarily, because when you think about some of the most influential books that have been written, whether it's like Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan or Machiavelli's The Prince, these are books that are written for elites. And the hope, I think, of the authors in cases like these is that other elites will read them and learn something from them, and then go out and from their positions of power and influence attempt to affect change. So how do we do that? And I think I think we should explore different options. If we do have think tanks, they shouldn't be in DC, that's for sure. Mises is based in, you guys are in Auburn, right?
Yes, Auburn, Alabama.
Right. Yeah. And then Chronicles is based in, right now, Minnesota, I think. Or no, that's where Charlemagne is based, which is the publisher. And Chronicles has been based out of Illinois since it was created. And we have no intention of moving to DC. And we have our own little educational fellowship there. I think we basically need more of this. I don't know if there's another easy way to do it. You can't snap your fingers and then overnight everyone just agrees with us that the Fed sucks, and we need to decentralize DC. This is a long project, and it's a difficult one that requires a lot of hard work. And I think electoral politics has kind of conditioned us to really dislike this stuff, because like elections that happen every 2 or 4 years, it's like a quick hit of dopamine, and and you get conditioned to that, and you stop thinking about like, oh God, 10 years, that's forever, you know. So I think that's a cultural aspect of the problem of focusing on things that are as ephemeral as the election that's coming up in 2 years.
If I can piggyback off of that, to the
Go
first
on.
point about some of that, kind of conservative socialism for certain interest groups. I mean, that's one of the things that worries me about Florida, is that you have so many of these corporations, locating to Florida because of this, legal environment that conservatives have made. And yet, to me, like if you're going to have a big bank come and relocate to Miami, like DeSantis should be saying, you don't get to come here and enjoy the tax perks of Florida and then deplatform conservatives, which is what we've seen. I mean, the weaponization of the banking industry. Like, so that's something that we need to take advantage. We need to stand firm on. Whereas, I mean, Texas has been bending over for these large corporations moving in for far too long, and I think that creates some of the issues. But the Mises Institute's mission for almost 40 years now has been precisely in that education of kind of this a parallel elite. And thankful. I mean, what's been great is that a lot of the Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin itself was in part inspired by work of the Institute. We've got a lot of people out there in very interesting positions, and so that's one of the things that we've tried to do. And I know you've been to Mises University, so we've been trying in practice, along with Chronicles as well, of filling these voids that are so desperately needed. Because the problem is that you can't simply ignore the benefits of higher education. You need to replace that. And again, I think things outside of DC, out of the Leviathan, without its tentacles of the state around it, I think that's where you really start getting some really radical things happening. And of course, having something interesting to say that really goes against, what you're going to get at a Harvard or a Yale. That's again where something I think the Austrian school has a lot of opportunities there.
Well, I think that social media and the internet is doing a great job to help you with those prospects. For example, España Confidencial is pretty much a newspaper that's based in Navarra in Spain. On the other hand, I live and work in Latin America, in Ecuador. And I've been inspired by the work of both libertarians and paleo conservatives. I'm not going to talk about neocons so those kind of people, as well as the Christian right in the United States. And pretty much you're educating a new kind of elite, but this kind of elite is not visible today. It's very obscure. It's trying to stay in the shadows for now. But I think that we can do something in the coming future. I'm thinking as well about the Hillsdale College I think it's Michigan, and these guys, they're doing pretty much the same work as you guys in Auburn with the Mises Institute, or in Chronicles, or in the Charlemagne Institute. So I think that we have options for now, but we have to do something more. I think that we just need a spark in order to create the great revolution we need, not only in the United States, but I think that in the rest of the Western world.
Well, and one of the things I think that has played so well into a lot of again, one of the things I'm very excited about in the U.S. is the change in Hispanic voting patterns in 2020, and I think a big part of that is that I think the left has vastly overplayed their hand with their very obvious hostility to Christianity. If you look at, for example, like political parties in Mexico, right? You have a lot of them that will range from, let's say Biden-style Democrats to Bernie Sanders-style Democrats, but they don't share the same hostility to religion. And I think that's the left being so blatant with it. It's accelerationism on the woke aspect, on the focus on the Black Lives Matter agenda and things like that. My hope is that more people now than ever before see how much these people genuinely despise them and the values they have. And so that's, again, I think that we've seen this globally, right? Part of that has to do with some of the economic insecurity after the financial crisis and this very weak recovery that we saw thereafter. But I think there's also that cultural acceleration in America. And what's scary is when that acceleration culturally is then echoed out through all those institutions of power that the globalist regime is kind of built around, right? And so that's, again, I do think this is an interesting moment, and perhaps my optimism is misplaced, but for all of the horrors that I think we could very well see, a lot of the pain, and I think we're not living in the best of times. I think that there are opportunities right now for an ideological awake right to take advantage of.
All right, Pedro.
No, I agree. I think we're all just kind of waiting for Caesar, as I like to say, because that's what it feels like. It feels like every year that goes by, people are more and more fed up with the American political system and view it as more and more illegitimate, which is, I mean, that's a good thing. It's interesting when you think of it like that the media, these DC think tanks, they'll talk about this in a very grave way, that it's very dangerous that people no longer trust in their institutions, because of course they would say that they work for those institutions, and you trusting them is how they stay employed and how they stay powerful. But I think I fully encourage this, and I think that we should encourage people. I think that's part of the elite project, is encouraging people to see that your government hates you, and it wants you dead when it doesn't want you extorted, and it has no interest really in like, count yourself lucky if you live in a place where you have like good local and like state representation, because I think that's increasingly rare. But the American, or I should say the United States, as distinct from like the American nation, the United States government is hostile to Americans in the same way that it's hostile to Iraqis. And that's, I think a lot of people sense that, but they don't know if they should say it out loud, because maybe it sounds unpatriotic or it sounds radical or something, but it's true. It's totally true. And I think that we should encourage more people to feel this way. That's one of the reasons why I'm frustrated with the conservative movement, is because for the longest time, opposition to whatever the US government was doing was kind of framed as being unpatriotic. You saw this with the January 6th incident, that immediately a lot of conservatives went way too far and wrote, like, called it an insurrection. And guys like David French were saying that we need to have a domestic counterinsurgency operation. He leaned into his 1 year in Iraq as an attorney to give us that bit of advice. Like, even before this, the Iraq War, conservatives labeled opponents of the Iraq War as unpatriotic. And implicitly, you were unpatriotic if you opposed the Patriot Act. And because it's called the Patriot Act, so how could you oppose the Patriot Act? So no, I think that this is a huge part of it, is seeing people, is helping people to see that the United States is different from, I think, from America. That these two things are, in a weird way, distinct from one another, and one is hostile to the other.
Well, I think that the last question, and I'm trying to make a reference to a comment that a friend of mine left in the chat, is about the relation both the paleo movement, both in its paleo-libertarian and its paleo-conservative versions, have with the American right, with the American Christian right, actually. Because, well, I've been engaging a little bit with these integralists and post-liberals guys in Twitter, and, well, they tend to go in the same way we do. But the problem is that they don't really are like we do. They are not populist. They are more part of the elite, or the Harvard and Notre Dame types of people. So what's the relationship we can have with this Catholic Christian right that is growing as well in the United States?
One of the things I think is promising. The fact that you actually have, like, the Catholic Church standing up and questioning, giving communion to Democrats that are pro-abortion. I mean, I like the fact that you're seeing, the media is freaking out right now. It seems like every other day you have a new hit piece about, the church is turning to QAnon. And unfortunately, though, is that so many of these religious institutions, like so many others, a lot of them have been taken over by the left, right? Even the Southern Baptists just lost a major battle over an adamant anti-critical race theory leader. Did not win election there. So there's issues there, I think, with the institutions. But I think that, again, the explicit and anti-Christian tenor of the left, I think, is awakening a lot of serious recognition on the threat the empire poses. But like with the integralists, though, and there's a lot of things obviously I disagree with. But I think that if libertarians don't engage honestly in identifying where our common ground is, then there's no chance that we're going to have a conversation where perhaps we can highlight, for example, Dr. Thomas Woods has done a wonderful job highlighting the free market traditions with the Catholic Church. Well, if you have libertarians out there celebrating sex workers, praising the altar of abortion and these sort of things in a cultural lens, as natural goods, then obviously you're not going to be able to have a conversation with Christians, with Catholic leaders, and have a reasonable dialogue. And so that's what I'm trying to do. Is I want to have conversations with people like Pedro. I want to have conversations with the traditional Catholic movement and identify areas of agreement, and then try to highlight where a lot of their concerns about the current economic status quo are perfectly valid, but then try to trace them back to, again, some of the aspects where Austrians, I think, have a very important contribution there intellectually. Because we can't do this alone. And the problem is too many libertarians would rather pat themselves in the back and go on the same 10 podcasts and say taxation is theft and get high fives. That's not useful for the cause of liberty. And so we need to be serious about this stuff, and we need to engage people where we have common ground with.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the Catholic movement is interesting. I know people that are part of it. I would say that I have friends who are part of it. I haven't really given too much thought to I guess where points of fundamental disagreement would be, because I haven't encountered any people like that. I'm sure that they're out there. I'm sure that I would run into them. But for the most part, the Catholics, I don't know if I want to call them trad Catholics, because that seems to be turning into kind of a pejorative to indicate someone who's not actually trad and has become a Catholic because it's edgy, but then basically is still like a Protestant. So, but I'll just call them trad Catholics in the nicest way possible. Their concern really just seems to be that they don't want their kids to grow up in like the hellish clown world that we seem to all be inheriting. And so if that means working with Protestants who are equally opposed to the proliferation of like transgenderism or equally opposed to abortion and things like that, then they're willing to do it. And I think that's basically where I'm at on that issue. I don't think the boat does not need to be rocked there. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's the total opposite. Like the people that I would not want to work with are those. Like someone who claims to be a trad Catholic, but then is also open to like transgenderism. That's not someone that I want to work with at all, regardless of what they believe, because I don't believe in that. I think it's harmful not just to the individuals who are suffering from what until recently we considered a mental illness, but I think it's also harmful to the social fabric to normalize that. So at least in my experience, I haven't met any trad Catholics or integralists who are like this and who I just like violently disagree with. I think that's the paleo movement. I think has had this problem in the past, or I should say paleo-conservative movement, where they've picked a lot of fights. Often they are right, but they've also picked a lot of the wrong fights. And so in a sense, they've been ecumenical in that you have like Paul Gottfried and like Murray Rothbard and St. Francis hanging out in the same room. But then on the other hand, they'll just it seems like they'll go out of their way sometimes to pick fights with other people. And so for my part, I'm trying to, I guess, this is a bridge that I'm actually trying to gap, is the bridge between the paleo conservatives and like the new Catholic conservatives, of which the paleos are kind of skeptical of because they're not sure what to make of them yet. I think they kind of associate them with like the First Things crowd, And if you know the history there's a lot of tension between Chronicles and First Things. And I'm hoping that I can kind of bridge this by showing people like, look, we all agree on these fundamental things, right? And we all don't want to leave like a terrible world for our children. And we all hate the existing political system. So there are things that we agree on that are really important, and it's worth trying to work them out because we need as many allies as we can get. So that's what I'm trying to do as a paleo-conservative representative.
Well, it's been great having you two guys come here and talk to me and talk to each other. I think that the main message we can all summarize from this talk is that we know who our allies are. We know which kind of libertarians, we know which kind of conservatives, we know which kind of religious people are on our side, and we know who is the enemy and what the enemy is trying to promote. So we're fighting the same fight, and as long as this fight is the same and we're in the same direction, we are all together. So thank you very much, guys, and I hope to have you two in the next program, well, whenever that's possible, and I hope to have you here as soon as possible. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks for
for
having
having
us. It's fun.